Welcome to Young Voices for Sustainability, a special segment of ESG Matters featuring inspiring youth in sustainability who are doing their part to drive the transition to a low carbon and climate resilient future. In each episode, we will have the privilege of hearing from outstanding young leaders on how they develop their passion for sustainability and related experiences. In this episode, we are very happy to have Andres with us. Hi, Andres. Thank you for joining us today. Let's begin with an introduction on your background and interests and how you got started in your sustainability journey.
Thank you for having me. Yes, so a bit about myself. I'm actually currently a year one environmental studies student at NUS. I was also part of the last year's Climate Youth Development Program. So just to give you guys, a bit of overview of what the Climate Youth Development Program was, is this Climate Youth Leadership Program that is being organized by three ministries, Ministry of Sustainability and Environment, National Youth Council, and also the National Climate Change Secretariat. And, I was fortunate enough to be one of the 20 selected to have the opportunity to attend COP29 as a Singapore Youth Delegate. And I think on your question about my sustainability journey, I would say that I'm actually quite new to the space. I only really started getting more involved, I would say last year. That was after my NS, where I decided to buy something that I really resonated with. And that kind of landed me in a non-profit. So before school started, I was actually interning at Jane Goodall Institute, Singapore, where they really focus on things like biodiversity conservation. And another thing that I was really very passionate about would be the youth outreach program, which is really looking at delivering meaningful climate education. Yeah, so I guess my interest really lies in the space of like climate policy, and also climate education. And in particular, right now, I'm dedicating quite a bit of my time to look into how we can make youth involvement in the climate space really very intentional and also finding ways to really value it to the conversation.
Yeah, so to get youth more involved, can you share more about the work you do with the Climate Youth Development Program?
Okay, so for the Climate Youth Development Program, it really is sort of capacity building program where we have the opportunity to really hear from industry leaders and also government people, right? And it started off with like a 5 days induction week where we really had like a crash course on like environmental policy and, basically Singapore's role in the whole sort of the climate change, climate landscape, right? And, it ventured on to also us finding certain sort of ways to collaborate with one another. So to give you guys a bit of context, the CYDP, there were 40 of us youths, and we were all coming from different backgrounds. There's, I think, a lot of them that are actually working already. So it's really quite nice to see how people from different backgrounds and different skill sets come together. And a part of this CYDP, this program, right, is also us given the opportunity to come together, brainstorm an idea, and come up with certain bottom-up projects or initiatives that we are interested in. But I would say moving forward with that, right, of course, it was then the COP29 opportunity that came about. And that really formed a big part of my experience at the Climate Youth Development Program because it was really quite, I would say, life-changing in a sense because we really had the opportunity to head to the biggest sort of like international stage, right? And before we went COP29, there was also a lot of preparation work involved where there was another series of really understanding a lot of policies. And also while we were there, our main KPIs included things like delivering our own youth program at the Singapore Pavilion. Yeah, so I think since 2 or 3 years ago, Singapore actually started establishing the youth pavilion at COP itself. Really a unique part of it was us having the opportunity to curate our own programs. So let's say for myself, right, I actually curated like a human library on climate resilience together with my fellow delegates. We delivered the whole sort of like human library workshop to over 100 sort of delegates and representative from the international space. And a second part of it was really a key takeaway was we had to also generate like a youth delegation report. And that really encompasses what are our viewpoints and what are certain sort of like policy recommendations or certain areas that we like to explore further. So we consolidated those viewpoints and put it under this youth delegation report that is then sent to the ministry for their review.
Yeah, so zooming into your experience at COP29, what was one thing that made it life-changing for you?
we were there for 6 days. It was really from day to night, and it can get very overwhelming in a sense. Like there were a lot going on, right? There were the negotiations, the side events, etc., etc. In particular, before we even go to COP29, we were quite strategic in a sense. Like each of us, we went in with like a specific problem statement or a specific area they would like to explore a bit further. So for myself, I went in focusing more on youth. In particular, I was interested to find out what are some of the best practices that overseas sort of youth organizations or youth leaders are doing in this climate space, and what are some lessons that perhaps Singapore can learn. And as a youth myself in Singapore, what are some of these key takeaways as you mentioned, right? And I would say one of the biggest learning point that I gained from this is really getting to understand the importance of network. Let me give you an example, right? So when we were there, we had opportunity to interact and with, let's say, people from Europe. One very key example that I could remember was speaking to someone from the Spanish Youth Council. It's quite interesting because certain ways and processes are a bit different overseas. For example, in a lot of the European countries, youth participation and youth representation in the climate space is a bit more institutionalized in a sense like they have a dedicated youth council that the government has to formally recognize and consult. Well, but in Singapore, the youth advocacy or involvement space is a bit different in a sense like there are engagements going on, but I would say it's a bit more informal and it's also a bit in nature. So I would say after speaking to him, the guy from the Spanish Youth Council, and also speaking to many different people from around the region, right? I would say ultimately I realized that for youth to really play a be in this space, right, there has to be sort of like a strong emphasis on really trying to build like a network because truth is there's a lot of people doing similar things. For example, there are a lot of environmental groups creating certain workshops, be it like let's say recycling or even like things like farming, for example. So I think there's really great value in trying to see how we can synergize certain groups and try to see how more collaboration and best practices can be sort of nurtured and curated, right? And I think this is also representative of what is it like to be on the international stage. Of course, when we were there, I think one of the key word or phrase that was being thrown around so much was like the idea of collaboration. But of course, when you think of it at a global level, when you look at the countries, right, different people have different sort of like agendas, responsibilities and expectations. And that is also why, certain aspects of, let's say, COP negotiations can hinder and take so long to process. So that really was one of the greatest sort of like realization that I had from COP.
Following COP29, what are some topics you hope to see progress on at COP30 this year?
So I would say, COP30 is happening at Belém, so Brazil. That's very interesting. I think just recently the COP30 presidency was mentioning he hoped that it'll be less of like words and more of action. And I think this is something that every COP mentioned, right? The truth is it's so hard to move the needle sometime and get countries together. But definitely, I think generally speaking, right, I think that there has to be sort of like the urgency to move and also for countries to also realize, right, that the output must be something that is worth all the carbon emissions, for example, right? Just recently, I think last year at COP29, there were also a bit of feedback in a sense like certain experts were thinking about reassessing or reevaluating things like COP processes, thinking in sense of like how much is it value adding, right? So I would say that definitely one thing that I am looking forward to or something that definitely needs really very, very close attention is really how there can be sort of really meaningful conversations, negotiations, collaborations, so that things that have been legacy issues, right? So, for example, if you look back a bit on history, right? So 2015 Paris Agreement and a lot of the articles being negotiated in the Paris Agreement, right? The negotiations has been going on for around a decade now already. So it's really a matter of when can certain things come to a conclusion. And I would say that, COP30 being, I think it was like COP28, COP29, COP30, right? So COP30, people kind of see it as like the area where a lot of things get consolidated. So definitely there's value in trying to reach that. I think if you look a bit more domestically, in particular for Singapore, I would say, my experiences at COP29 also made me realize like what are we doing on the international stage, right? I think it was nice to see how Singapore actually utilized, or rather I say maximize, our presence in this climate space. Was at the Singapore Pavilion looking at how certain things are being run, right? And Singapore has always play the role of very strong, like like negotiator, for example, and someone that is really out there to focus on things like collaboration. So I witnessed like MOU signings and also like us showing like why are we there. And I think that intentionality is I look forward to at the also, so that let's say domestically also speaking, right? In things like, for example, carbon credits, is definitely something that there's really value to keep track of. And hopefully, who knows, there can be better outcomes in COP30. Yeah.
So people are talking about climate anxiety that is widespread among youth as they grow up witnessing environmental catastrophes and also see their future through the lens of a climate crisis ahead. Do you feel this way? And if so, what inspires you to keep going despite the challenges?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. It's something that I struggle with a bit personally also. Coming back from COP29, right? After seeing a lot of the big picture thing, definitely I felt a sense of, I would say, a bit like frustrated and also a bit like maybe a bit hopeless in a sense also. More towards I started questioning about some of the value adding component of the practices that we are doing, right? And I would say that, things like climate anxiety is really very prevalent and it can definitely lead to things like apathy, right? I think when you question, the average sort of like youth these days, it's not very common to see things like climate change and, the willingness to act on it being top three priority, for example, right? And I would say this is something that I'm also trying to figure out along the way. But I would say one sort of like something that really inspired me, right, is really understanding like the position that I am in, considering how there's certain sort of resources out there that I was fortunate enough to be able to tap on, right, to really expand my horizon and grow in this space. And I would say that privilege is something that really stuck with me, and it gives me assurance that there is sort of like an opportunity for me to enact certain small changes, if you would say so, right? Influence certain other youths, for example. Yeah. So and I think one more thing that is quite important is all the youths out there. Is really finding that community. I think it's a lot easier to go through all these like big picture issues when you're able to surround yourself with people that are like-minded, they are passionate. And personally for me, so just to share a bit, I'm actually part of this organization called like the Inter-University Environmental Coalition, where we are really trying to provide that platform to bring together the different sort of environmental university groups all around Singapore and create that opportunity for member groups to collaborate, to exchange best practices. And what we really like to cultivate is really this community to show people that things like climate anxiety is not something that you have to sort of navigate through alone. And I also understand that the inertia to get started sometimes, right, can be a bit high. Right, the barrier can be a bit high, and we really want to make it a lot more accessible for the everyday sort of use, and also help people to understand the interconnectedness of issues. For example, you study environmental studies, and then only if you study environmental studies, then can you get into the sustainability space, right? The truth is, a lot of companies and a lot of places out there are trying to green their portfolio, right? And sustainability is something that's so interconnected to like so many sectors, right? So it's really something that can be accessible to the everyday use, so that they don't feel so helpless, and at the same time they find it being value adding to different aspects of their lives, right? So not only doing it purely out of passion, but perhaps because there's some financial incentive or perhaps there's some opportunities for them out there. Yeah, so that's really a summary of what I'm working on, and also what I hope youths can kind of realize if they ever feel like climate anxious.
Thank you, Andres, for sharing your thoughts. I especially like the point on finding a like-minded community to navigate through challenges and collaborate on finding solutions together. I hope this chat has allowed the audience to gain some insight into the work of the Climate Youth Development Program, how it is like on the ground as a youth delegate at COP, and navigating through climate anxiety. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.